Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
For tonight, I'd like to welcome Chrisopher. Chris is from the Department of Philosophy in York, so he's come far away by train. And he has stepped in. We had obviously had somebody else plan, but her life got in the way. And so he graciously said that he would come and speak for us on the subject of progress and practicality, which is something I'm looking forward to because it sounds like it reformulates. Sometimes I start using the words and the language of practicality myself, and I often get taken to task for it, for being too much of an engineer. And if you are going to tweet, we do in fact have a Twitter account. It's at Cafe Culture NE. And so over to Chris.
Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is my first time in Newcastle, actually, and I love the city. Everywhere looks good in the sunshine, obviously, but it's a fantastic city. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to talk about some things which I've been thinking about to do with impossible ideals and things which we might aim at, and ideals of justice, which are seemingly unattainable. And there's lots of different questions we could ask about impossible ideals or unattainable goals. And I'm largely going to be talking about one particular argument, but perhaps in the discussion we can open it out and talk more generally. But I'll just mention a couple of things first, which are slightly different from the thing which I will be talking about mainly. So, of course, very often when there are debates, political debates, moral debates, between people where the issue of practicality or how reasonable a suggestion is comes up, the disagreement is really about whether it's true that a suggestion that's been made is impractical or whether it places particularly great burdens upon people. And that's really not, as far as I can see, a disagreement on a matter of principle. It's a disagreement just about the facts of the case. Is it the case that you really could implement this measure without raising taxes enormously? Or is it the case that doing this really would require very onerous legislation that would get in the way of people's lives or whatever? So I'm not going to be concerned so much with those sorts of questions. I'm not going to be concerned with what you might think of as just ordinary factual questions about how impractical something, in fact, is going to turn out to be. I'm going to be concerned more with whether it's right, in the first place, to be suspicious of some proposal or some suggestion on the basis of its being impractical. So I dare say that a lot of us, because I think this is a very common thought, so I dare say a lot of us, if we think that some suggestion that's been made about justice or about politics or about morality is impractical in the sense that it requires something of us which is impossible, we're inclined to think that that suggestion is a bad one on that basis, right? Now, perhaps there are some of you who don't think that, but I think it's very common, certainly in public debate, for whether or not some goal is attainable to be one of the first hurdles that needs to be cleared if somebody is making a proposal, right? So if somebody says, we ought to do this, or this is unjust and wrong and something needs to be done about it, how realistic it is to do something about it is one of the first questions that people ask, and if it's deemed to be unrealistic to do anything about it, then the proposal is largely dismissed as utopian and pie in the sky and silly. And I'm going to be arguing that we should not endorse that idea. We should not endorse the idea that once we've established that some idea about justice or some proposal about what we should do is impractical, that means that it's not one that we should take seriously. Right? And I'm going to present a particular argument that's supposed to justify that conclusion, but obviously in the discussion it would be great to just talk about the broader issues, and you may have arguments of your own that go in one direction or the other. So the other thing to say just before I get onto that argument is there's another kind of idea about impossible ideals, which is kind of close in the vicinity, but which isn't quite the one that I'm talking about either. So very often people talk about what Kant and others called regulative ideals. And regulative ideals are those things which we set as ideals or as goals, but which we know we can't achieve, and we just try and get as close to them as possible. Right? So it's reasonably common for people to accept the idea that there are certain things that we should be aiming at, even though we can't get there, because getting as close as we can is still a good thing. Now, I'm not going to be talking about that a great deal, but there is one thing to note about that idea, I think. So you might assume that everything which is worth achieving is worth getting as close to as you possibly can, even if you can't achieve it. But a bit of reflection, I'm sure, will remind you that that's not true, right? So if it's worth curing somebody's illness, especially if it's not a life-threatening one, if it's worth curing someone's illness by performing some operation, that doesn't mean that it's worth trying to get as close as you can by opening them up and then not completing the operation, right? Because all you've done there is you've made them worse off than they were before. So in general, it's not true that every ideal which is worth aiming at in its best case is also worth doing the best you can if you know you can't get all the way. But as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about those kinds of things, and I'm not going to give you any ideas about how to sort out the ones where you should try and do the best you can from the ones where you shouldn't. But we can talk about that as well if you want. Okay, so the argument that I do want to concentrate on starts from something which I think should, and when philosophers say this, it's always with hope in their heart rather than certainty, should be uncontroversial. So we are not infallible when it comes to surveying and knowing what the actual possibilities are. Very often we underestimate the real possibilities. Very often we overestimate the real possibilities. And very often we do both at the same time. And if that sounds paradoxical, it's actually not, because all that means is that sometimes you're failing to see some real possibilities whilst you're inventing some non-real ones, right? So you can make both mistakes at the same time. But the mistakes that I'm going to be concentrating on are the ones where we underestimate the possibilities, where we're thinking about how the world might turn out, and we simply miss, we don't notice that there are some options further down the line. And in particular, and I think this is going to be especially important for the kind of moral and political cases that I think are most interesting, we tend, I think, and it would be interesting to know whether you agree with this, but I think it's plausible that we tend to underestimate those possibilities more the more difficult and inconvenient they are for us. So it's a kind of natural human self-defense mechanism, I think, to tell yourself that something isn't an option when you don't really want it to be an option. So very often we hear people claiming that it's literally not possible for the money that they might give to charity to do any good. And that, I think, can't be a realistic response to the evidence, because, of course, you could find something to do with that money which would help somebody be better off than they are. What's really going on there, I think, is that it's just an unfortunate fact of life that the demands upon us are great and our resources are limited, and so in order to not be weighed down by the burden of guilt, we have to a certain extent, think, well, there's only a certain amount I could do anyway, so it's okay if I don't try and do everything. So for perfectly understandable psychological reasons, I think it's very plausible that we're always underestimating the possibilities just because we're not perfect in our knowledge, and in particular we're underestimating the possibilities where those possibilities are inconvenient for us or would require a great effort or would require us to change our way of life in radical ways and things like that. Okay. So if we accept that, we are very, very often underestimating the real range of options of what can be achieved and how things can turn out, then I think that tells us that accepting the principle that impractical proposals shouldn't be taken seriously is a very dangerous thing. Because take the principle that if a proposal is impractical, then it shouldn't be taken seriously. If you believe that principle, if you accept it, then it's only rational for you to use what you think about the possibilities to assess which proposals you should take seriously, right? If you think that impractical proposals can't possibly be good ones or can't be ones that deserve to be taken seriously, then if you think that the proposal turns out to be impractical, then it's only rational for you to reject it and to not take it seriously, right? But then, if we put all that together, what that means is that mistakes which we make about what the real range of possibilities might be get translated into mistakes we might be making about what the real facts about justice might be and about what we ought to do. Right? So we go from a relatively innocuous seeming lack of knowledge about the full range of options via accepting this principle that we shouldn't take impractical principles seriously to conclusions about justice and about morality and about how things should be, which are simply false and erroneous. So, I'll give some examples in a little while, and the examples are going to be historical ones, and that's not accidental, because of course the joy of historical examples is that we're now in a position to see precisely what the mistake was and precisely the damage that it did, whereas contemporary examples would be prone to disagreements about whether we're making a mistake here or not, right? So we can talk about some contemporary examples later perhaps, but I'm going to give you some historic examples in a bit. So I hope it's reasonably clear what the first stage of the argument is. If we accept the idea that impractical principles don't deserve to be taken seriously, then because we make mistakes about what's practically possible and what's not, we will end up making mistakes about which proposals to act on and which not, because we'll mistakenly think that some perfectly good proposals are impractical, which in fact aren't. And that's going to matter because those might be proposals that are about rectifying injustices or making people much better off in important ways. And I could rest the argument there. And I could just say, well, it's morally important that you have the right ideas about those things. So if accepting this principle about practicality leads you to make mistakes about what justice really requires, then that in itself is a bad thing about accepting the principle. But I think actually you can extend the argument a little bit further still. So that's what I'll do now. Our attention, our mental effort that we've got available to us, as well as our resources, our monetary resources and all sorts of other material resources and our energy and all sorts of things, are limited. They're finite, and there's lots of things that place demands upon them. And so, very often, we know that we can't do everything which it would be good to do. Right? There's all sorts of good things in the world that we could all be doing now, that we acknowledge it would be good to do, but you've only got a certain amount of time in your life and effort and money and whatever, so we don't do it all. We prioritize. And if you are somebody who, and I'm going to say this unashamedly, is properly sensitive to the demands of morality, right? I happen to think that there are demands of morality, and I think that it makes sense to talk about people being deficient in not being properly sensitive to those demands. So if you're properly sensitive to the demands of morality, then knowing that something is unjust or that something is morally very important is going to be a very powerful motive for you, because that's what it is to be properly sensitive to the demands of morality. It's for ideas about justice and well-being to actually move you in certain ways to action and to effort. So, if you're properly sensitive to the demands of morality, then when you reach the conclusion that something is unjust or that some effort needs to be made to improve people's lives, then you will be inclined to make some efforts that perhaps you wouldn't have been inclined to make otherwise. That moral conclusion about it will itself give you extra reason to do something that you wouldn't have done otherwise. So how does that connect up with the argument that I started with about making mistakes about the possibilities? Well, suppose you agree with me in the first part of what I said. Suppose you agree that we don't have perfect knowledge of what the options are and of what the outcomes will be of those options, and that therefore, if we accept the principle which says that we should ignore any impractical suggestions, we are going to be led to make mistakes about what it's worth doing and what it's not worth doing. Well, that means that given that we are imperfect in our knowledge in those ways, we are going to end up lacking some very important moral motives, right? So suppose I think that a particular political arrangement or economic distribution is unjust, that it does wrong to somebody. If I'm properly sensitive to the demands of morality, then I'm going to take that as a reason to investigate to a greater extent than I would do otherwise, what the other ways of arranging things might be, or how I could mitigate the effects of this system or this arrangement on the people whom it harms. I'm going to take the fact that it's wrong that these people are harmed as an additional reason to do something about it, over and above just the fact that they're harmed, because people are harmed in all sorts of ways all over the world, but the fact that they're harmed wrongfully seems to give me a greater reason to worry about that. So sometimes thinking of something as an injustice, or thinking of something as a wrong which is perpetrated upon somebody, can lead you to see ways of doing things differently that you wouldn't see otherwise, because you simply wouldn't be motivated to investigate what the other options might have been. And there's an analogy that might help make the point. So instead of thinking about moral judgments, think about when you really, really want something. And that similarly has a kind of motivational effect, much more than the moral judgments in most cases, I dare say. So I really, really want a new guitar. And I count the money in my piggy bank, and I find that I haven't got enough money for a new guitar. But I still really, really want it. And so it's plausible that my really, really wanting it means I sit down and I scratch my head and I think, okay, there's not the money in the piggy bank, but could I sell something to raise the money? Could I perhaps tap somebody for a loan? Could I look fondly upon an aging, wealthy relative? Right? Whatever. I can investigate what the other options might be, because the desire is still there, and the inconvenient facts which I've discovered don't satisfy me. I want to find a way of overcoming them. And I'm suggesting that if you are somebody who really is moved by moral considerations, and of course not everyone is, but if you are, then those moral considerations can have a similar effect. They can motivate you to not be satisfied with the conclusion that you first find about what the real options are. Just like desiring something means that you're not satisfied with the fact that you can't afford it, and you go back and you rework the calculations and you rethink through the options, etc. Okay. So, imagine you are one of these people, or maybe you don't have to imagine it, maybe you are one of these people, who thinks that impractical proposals aren't worth taking seriously. And now you've made a mistake, suppose, about what the real possibilities are. So there's this suggestion that some social arrangement or some economic arrangement is unjust and that we ought to reform it. And as it seems to you, that's just not possible. We can't reform it, right? Everything that we value depends upon this kind of social arrangement, right? If you are satisfied to say that therefore it can't be an injustice, it can't be wronging anyone, because after all it's a necessity, then you have every reason to let matters rest there. Right? Just as if your desire for something disappeared when you discovered that you couldn't afford it. Right? I'm suggesting that the principle that only practical principles are worth taking seriously has the same effect as your desires disappearing when you find that you can't afford something would have. Right? And now I think we can make I was going to say an interesting move. It's for you to judge whether it's interesting. We can make a noteworthy move. So what I've been suggesting is that if you accept this principle, which I'm attacking, then you're going to end up not being motivated to find solutions which really are there to be found. You made a mistake about whether there's some alternative to the way we're doing things. And if you were motivated to go back and rethink everything, you might have discovered that it was a mistake. But since you're not motivated to go back and rethink it, because you're happy to say, well, because my first judgment was that it's necessary, then it must be morally okay, then you're just never going to get to realizing that there was, in fact, another way. Just like if you can't afford something on your first calculation and you just decide that therefore you don't want it, perhaps you were wrong in your first calculation, but you'll never discover that because you won't go and repeat the calculations, hopefully, right, trying to work out a way of affording it. Right? So not being satisfied with what you think in the first instance are the real possibilities is a way of doing better. Right? If you're not satisfied, you go back, you recheck, you apply a bit more creativity to the problem, and then you might discover that you were wrong. And that means that if you are prepared to endorse the idea that there are such things as necessary evils, that some things which can't be changed are unjust, you might end up discovering that you were wrong in the first place thinking that they can't be changed. Right? You think, well, this is a necessary evil, but it's an evil. I don't like living with evil. Am I really sure that it's a necessary one? And you go back and you think with all your might about the possible ways that human beings could be, because you can't rest content with the idea that there's this evil in the world, and lo and behold, you were wrong. There is another way. Now, if that happened, you would end up in a position where you could now solve a practical problem that you couldn't have solved otherwise. Right? So there's a real solution out there. But you're only going to find the solution if you recognize it as a problem. And you're only going to recognize it as a problem if you're willing to recognize that there's something unjust about it. But you're only going to recognize that there's something unjust about it, given that you mistakenly thought that it was necessary and there was no other alternative, if you think that it's at least possible that something could be unjust, even if there's no alternative to it. Right? So there's a kind of chain of thinking which starts with this initial judgment about what's possible. And if you're open-minded to the idea that even some necessities can be unjust or wrong, you can actually end up finding that there was a solution after all, and therefore solving the problem that really was there. And I think that's noteworthy because what it suggests is that there's actually a pragmatic argument for rejecting the pragmatic principle. The pragmatic principle says, only take seriously suggestions or proposals or principles which seem realistic, which seem not to involve impossibilities. But what I've tried to suggest is that actually that has really bad pragmatic consequences. Because what it means is that there are real problems there which will be left there unaddressed because you will fail to be motivated to find the solutions. So I think if you really seriously care in a pragmatic way about avoiding injustice or about improving people's well-being or about any of the other stuff that morally or politically or socially or even personally matters, then you should reject the principle which says that necessarily, if a proposal is impractical or impossible, then it's not worth taking seriously. So in a nutshell, well, that's not enough of a nutshell for you, but in as brief a form as I think I could do it, that's the argument that I want to propose. Okay, so, how am I doing for time? Goodness. Okay, so I'll quickly give you some of those examples that I promised you. Bernard Mandeville, I don't know whether anyone's come across Bernard Mandeville's writings. He was most famous, I think, for writing The Fable of the Bees. But he wrote other things besides. And in 1723, Mandeville wrote an essay on charity and charity schools. Now, those of you who are familiar with Mandeville will not be surprised to learn that Mandeville was not keen on charity and charity schools. He thought that the people who set them up and donate to them were puffed up and self-congratulatory, and he thought that the charity schools themselves were a terrible idea. And he thought that the schools were a terrible idea for something like the following reason. He argued that the only way that prosperity can be achieved, and by prosperity here, I think if we're charitably interpreting him, right, let's assume he doesn't just mean prosperity for the very best off, but let's assume he means the only way a reasonable level of prosperity for us all can be achieved is if there is a large pool of not very well educated, not very sophisticated individuals who are quite happy to do the things that need doing for not much money and without much else going on in their lives to distract them. Because, of course, once they have more desires, you're going to have to pay them more money for them to think that it's worthwhile working so they can satisfy those sophisticated desires they've now got for things like books, God forbid. And the more educated they are, the more options they'll have, so they won't have to settle for doing the menial work that you want to pay them very little for doing. And there's lots of that menial work that needs doing, so it's just an economic fact that you've got to have this pool of people, and therefore you don't want to go around educating everyone into the state where they're not happy to do these things anymore. And of course, he would have made exactly the same argument against universal education of the sort that we have now. Charity schools were the closest that they had in his days. This was in 1723 he published this essay. So I want to use him as an example, and you can probably see how this is going to go, in the following way. Mandeville's argument is that it's no good wringing your hands about the plight of these people who need educating, because it's just impractical to think that we should educate them. It would mean ruin for society, right? There's no way that we could actually educate people to a reasonable level and still enjoy even the reasonably moderate level of social existence that most of us have. right? So if you think that most of us being reasonably comfortably off is a worthwhile endeavor, then you've just got to accept that having these uneducated classes is a necessity, and therefore it's not unjust that we have them. It's not that we're wronging them by leaving them in this state, because to say that it was wrong would be to say that there was some alternative, which we're not taking. And there is no alternative, so it can't be wrong. Right? And that is a direct application of precisely the principle which I'm warning you against, and which probably sounds so very plausible when you state it in the abstract. Right? What Mandeville is arguing is that any suggestion that treating these people, well, any suggestion that failing to educate them or that failing to cultivate their tastes is wronging them falls foul of this principle which says that something can't be wrong if it's a necessity. It's a necessity, so it can't be wrong. Now, of course, what we know, and Mandeville didn't, and we can debate whether Mandeville should have known it, given his state of information. Perhaps he was perfectly entitled not to know it, but nonetheless, what we know, and Mandeville didn't, is that it's simply not true that the only way of most of us having a reasonable level of comfort in existence is to have a class of people who are entirely uneducated and left to do the stuff that nobody else wants to do because they don't know that there's more to life, right? And similarly, the other example I want to give you is the ancient Greek attitude towards slavery. Now, some ancient Greeks were particularly sanguine about slavery. They thought that it was an element of, Aristotle thought that it was an element of natural justice, if you please. But some of them were less extreme than that, and a quite common view amongst at least a certain period of ancient Greeks was that, of course, it's very, very bad for somebody to be enslaved. But by the same token, of course, there has to be such an institution, because how could you possibly have a cultivated society of people who have the leisure to pursue art and science and philosophy without a group of people whose sole purpose is to keep all that ticking over by doing all the stuff that nobody else wants to do? And of course, what we know, and the Greeks didn't, and we can argue about whether they were culpable not to know this or not, but what we know and the Greeks didn't, is that it's simply not true that in order for us to have a reasonable level of cultivation in art and science, etc., you have to have a class of people who are in the position of ancient Greek slaves. But those people who argued that it was a necessity and therefore that we shouldn't wring our hands over it and condemn it were applying precisely that principle which I'm warning you against. And I think when you see historical examples of the application of this principle, you can see the danger that I'm pointing towards. If Mandeville, for example, had been able to think of the plight of the people in charity schools as a matter of justice, if he'd have been able to acknowledge that you wrong somebody by putting them in a position to enjoy the ordinary benefits of a basic level of education, then he would have had a motive to re-examine that assumption he made about the necessity of it. And we can wonder whether if enough people had reasons to re-examine those assumptions might have been overturned a little sooner. And I take it we don't need to argue about whether it would have been a good thing for those assumptions to have been overtaken a little sooner. So moral and political and social progress, I'm suggesting, and this is the practical side of the argument, actually comes about more efficiently in some cases if we don't feel bound to the principle which says something is only worth worrying about, something is only worth condemning, something is only worth labeling as unjust if there is no practical alternative. Because that's just a way of turning our more or less harmless, limited knowledge into some very dangerous moral complacency. And I take it that dangerous moral complacency is a pragmatically bad thing if one of the things we want to achieve is moral progress. But I should probably stop now, is that right? Have I gone half an hour? Okay, so I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.